On March 23, 2021, a single container ship cost global commerce $9.6 billion per day. For 6 days, one vessel held $54 billion worth of goods hostage and paralyzed 12% of world trade. The container ship Ever Given, operated by the shipping company Evergreen, didn't just run aground in the Suez Canal. It exposed the most terrifying truth about modern logistics. The entire global economy operates on a knife's edge, and a single ship in the wrong place can cost more than the GDP of 40 countries combined. This is the story of how 20,000 containers, one sandstorm, and 400 meters of steel revealed that your smartphone, your car, and your morning coffee depend on a supply chain with zero margin for error, and the financial consequences are still reshaping global trade today. Let's start with what actually happened. At 7:40 a.m. Egyptian time on March 23, 2021, the Ever Given, a container ship longer than the Empire State Building is tall, entered the Suez Canal carrying cargo worth approximately $775 million. The ship measured 400 meters from bow to stern, 59 meters wide, and stood as tall as a 20-story building. It could carry 20,124 20-foot equivalent units, making it one of the largest container ships ever built. Within minutes, a violent sandstorm with winds exceeding 40 knots swept across the canal. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the Ever Given, traveling at 12.8 knots in the single-lane southern section of the canal, began to lose control. At 7:42 a.m., the ship's bow swung hard to starboard and crashed into the eastern bank of the canal. The stern simultaneously slammed into the western bank, wedging the massive vessel diagonally across the entire 205-meter width of the waterway. The Suez Canal, which handles 12% of global trade and 30% of all container ship traffic, was completely blocked, not partially obstructed, completely shut down. Here's where the numbers get staggering. With 8 hours, ships began backing up on both sides of the canal like cars in a parking lot. By day 2, more than 200 vessels were waiting. By day 3, over 300 ships carrying $3 billion worth of goods daily were stuck. By the time the Ever Given was finally freed 6 days later, 369 ships were anchored in the queue with an additional 31 ships waiting to enter the canal. Those 400 vessels represented more than just delayed deliveries. They carried oil tankers hauling 9.6 million barrels of crude livestock carriers, with tens of thousands of animals running low on feed and water, and container ships packed with everything from automotive parts to consumer electronics. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's most authoritative publication, calculated that westbound traffic through the Suez Canal typically carries $5.1 billion in goods per day. Eastbound traffic carries another $4.5 billion daily. That's $9.6 billion in trade paralyzed every single day the canal remained blocked. To put that in perspective, that's more than the annual GDP of Monaco, Liechtenstein, and several other nations combined, lost every 24 hours. But here's what makes this truly catastrophic. It wasn't just the ships in the queue that felt the impact. The blockage created a shockwave that rippled across every major supply chain on the planet within 72 hours. Let me show you how one ship in the wrong place brought the global economy to its knees. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why logistics executives still lose sleep over what happened in March 2021. The Suez Canal isn't just any shipping route. Opened in 1869, this 120-mile artificial waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea is the single most critical shipping bottleneck on Earth. Before the canal existed, ships traveling from Asia to Europe had to sail around the entire continent of Africa, a journey of 19,000 miles that added 3 to 4 weeks to every voyage. The Suez Canal cut that distance to 7,000 miles, slashing transit time by 40% and fuel costs by millions of dollars per voyage. Today, 50 to 60 ships pass through the Suez Canal daily during normal operations. In 2020, the canal handled 18,829 vessels carrying 1.17 billion tons of cargo. That's roughly equivalent to moving 234 Great Pyramids of Giza worth of goods every single year. The canal generates approximately $5.6 billion annually in toll revenue for Egypt, making it the country's third largest source of foreign currency after tourism and remittances. Each ship pays an average toll of $300,000 to $700,000, depending on size and cargo. The Ever Given itself would have paid approximately $700,000 for its transit. Instead, that single passage cost the global economy an estimated $57.6 billion in the 6 days it remained stuck. Halted insurance claims that eventually reached $916 million and triggered supply chain disruptions that lasted for months. Now, here's the part most people miss. The Suez Canal has no backup. There's no alternative route between Asia and Europe that doesn't add weeks to shipping time and millions in extra costs. Sure, ships can sail around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, but that route adds 3,500 miles and 7 to 10 days to the journey from Asia to Europe, increasing fuel costs by approximately $300,000 to $400,000 per vessel and delivery times by a week or more. So, when the Ever Given blocked the canal, shipping companies faced an impossible choice: wait in the queue and hope for a quick resolution, or reroute around Africa and guarantee massive delays and cost overruns. Most chose to wait. That decision created one of the most expensive traffic jams in human history, and it was about to get much, much worse. Let's talk about what was actually tracked in that queue, because this wasn't just about delayed packages or inconvenienced retailers. This was about the physical manifestation of global trade grinding to a halt. Among the 400 ships waiting at the canal were 41 bulk carriers hauling grain, coal, and minerals. There were 25 oil tankers carrying 9.6 million barrels of crude oil, valued at approximately $600 million, along with refined petroleum products worth hundreds of millions more. 5 livestock carriers were stuck in the queue with cattle, sheep, and other animals aboard. These ships, designed to transport live animals between continents, faced a rapidly escalating crisis as feed and water supplies dwindled with each passing day. The container ships in the queue held an estimated $3 billion worth of consumer goods, auto parts, electronics, and raw materials. Each day of delay meant factories in Europe running short on components, retailers missing seasonal merchandise deadlines, and perishable goods deteriorating in containers. The financial calculation was brutal. Every day of waiting cost shipping companies an average of $24,000 per vessel in fuel, crew wages, and opportunity costs. Multiply that by 400 ships, and you're looking at $9.6 million daily in direct costs to shipowners alone. But those numbers are pocket change compared to the actual cargo value. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London estimated that each day of blockage reduced the value of goods in transit by approximately $400 million due to delivery penalties, missed contracts, and depreciation. European automakers were hit particularly hard. BMW, Volkswagen, and other manufacturers relying on just-in-time delivery of parts from Asia began experiencing component shortages within 72 hours of the blockage. One German automotive supplier reported that a single shipment of electronic control modules worth $12 million was trapped on a container ship in the queue. Without those parts, 3 assembly lines producing 600 vehicles daily would be forced to shut down within a week. The oil market reacted immediately. Brent crude prices spiked 6% in the first 2 days of the blockage, jumping from $60.77 per barrel to $64.41. As traders priced in potential supply disruptions and delays in refined products reaching European markets. Natural gas and petroleum product shipments faced similar volatility. Approximately 2.5 million barrels of liquefied natural gas transit the Suez daily, and the blockage created price spikes across European energy markets as utilities scrambled to secure alternative supplies. But here's what nobody saw coming: the cascade effects across industries that had nothing to do with the ships in the queue. And that's where the real economic damage was hiding. The ever-given blockage revealed something that supply chain experts had been warning about for years, but executives had largely ignored. Modern logistics operates with zero redundancy, and that's a feature, not a bug, until suddenly it becomes a catastrophic vulnerability. Let me explain. In the 1980s and 90s, companies maintained large warehouse inventories as buffers against supply disruptions. A typical manufacturer might keep 60 to 90 days of raw materials and components in stock at any given time. But inventory is expensive. It ties up capital, requires warehouse space, risks obsolescence, and generates holding costs. So companies embraced just-in-time manufacturing, a philosophy pioneered by Toyota that aims to receive goods exactly when needed, minimizing inventory to near zero. By 2020, the average U.S. manufacturer maintained just 1.43 months of inventory, down from 2.1 months in 1992. Retailers operated even leaner, with many holding less than 30 days of stock and relying on continuous replenishment from overseas suppliers. This system works brilliantly, until it doesn't. And when the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal, that entire philosophy collapsed in real time across dozens of industries simultaneously. European furniture retailers were among the first to feel the pain. IKEA, which sources 70% of its products from Asia, had multiple container ships trapped in the Suez queue, carrying seasonal spring merchandise. Every day of delay meant missed sales targets for garden furniture, outdoor items, and home goods. Electronics retailers faced similar pressure. One major UK consumer electronics chain reported that 6 shipping containers of TVs, laptops, and smartphones worth $4.8 million were stuck aboard a vessel in the canal. Those products were already pre-sold for Easter promotions, with delivery contracts carrying penalty clauses of $50,000 per day for late arrival. The pharmaceutical industry faced critical shortages. India, which supplies 40% of global generic drug production and 70% of the world's vaccine manufacturing capacity, ships most of its products through the Suez Canal to European and American markets. Active pharmaceutical ingredients for blood pressure medications, antibiotics, and other critical drugs were trapped in containers aboard ships that couldn't move. European health authorities began monitoring inventory levels at hospitals and pharmacies, preparing for potential shortages if the blockage lasted more than a week. The coffee industry. Yes, even your morning espresso was affected. East African coffee exporters shipped through the Suez Canal, and roasters in Europe began to see supply constraints within days. Coffee futures prices on ICE Exchange jumped 3.5% as traders anticipated tightening supplies. Textile manufacturers in Bangladesh and Vietnam, which export $40 billion worth of apparel annually to Europe and North America, saw their shipments frozen mid-transit. Fast fashion retailers like H&M and Zara operate on 4-6-week inventory cycles, and the blockage threatened to disrupt spring and summer collections entirely. Construction projects across Europe faced material shortages. Chinese steel, Turkish tiles, and Asian electrical components worth hundreds of millions of dollars sat immobilized in the canal queue, while construction deadlines approached and penalty clauses loomed. But here's the truly insidious part. Even products that weren't in the canal suffered delays, because here's what happens when 12% of global shipping capacity suddenly vanishes from the market. Shipping companies rerouting around Africa created instant capacity shortages on other routes. Available container space became scarce, and freight rates, already elevated due to pandemic-related disruptions, spiked again. Freight rates from Asia to Europe jumped 30% in the week following the blockage, from $8,000 per 40-foot container to over $10,000. Some routes saw even steeper increases, with spot rates hitting $15,000 to $16,000, as shippers desperate for space bid up available capacity. This created a second wave of disruptions. Companies with goods ready to ship from Asia suddenly couldn't find available container space or couldn't afford the suddenly inflated rates. Factories began to slow production, workers faced reduced hours, and order cancellations rippled across supplier networks. The compounding effects turned what should have been a localized incident into a global crisis, and it all traced back to one ship stuck sideways in a canal for 6 days. Now, let's talk about the actual rescue operation, because freeing a 220,000-ton ship wedged into a sandbank isn't exactly a straightforward towing job. This was engineering and logistics on a scale that had never been attempted before. The Suez Canal Authority immediately mobilized every resource available: 8 tugboats, 2 dredgers, and teams of maritime salvage experts. The initial plan seemed simple: dredge sand away from the bow, refloat the ship on the next high tide, and tow it free. Except the Ever Given's bow was buried under 706,000 cubic feet of sand and mud, roughly equivalent to filling 3 Olympic swimming pools with desert. The ship's weight had driven it 65 feet into the eastern embankment, creating a massive anchor of sediment holding the vessel in place. Dredging teams worked around the clock, removing approximately 30,000 cubic meters of sand and mud over the first 3 days. Each cubic meter weighed roughly 1.5 tons, meaning crews had to excavate and remove 45,000 tons of material just to expose the ship's hull. Meanwhile, tugboats with a combined pulling power of 400 tons attempted to wrench the vessel free during high tides. It wasn't nearly enough. The Ever Given remained stuck fast, barely budging despite maximum effort from the tugboat fleet. The salvage company Smith Salvage and the Japanese firm Nippon Salvage were called in on day 2. They immediately ordered additional heavy-duty tugboats from across the region, bringing total pulling capacity to over 700 tons. On day 4, the salvage teams attempted a new strategy: lighten the ship by removing ballast water and fuel. Pumps removed 9,000 tons of ballast water from the Ever Given's tanks, reducing the ship's draft and hopefully decreasing the pressure holding it against the embankment. Excavators and dredgers continued their relentless work, operating 24 hours a day under floodlights. By day 5, they had removed a total of 50,000 cubic meters of material, equivalent to 20 Olympic swimming pools worth of sand and mud. The tides became the critical variable. The full moon on March 28th would bring unusually high tides, offering the best chance to refloat the ship. Salvage teams calculated that the spring tide would raise water levels in the canal by an additional 18 inches, potentially providing just enough buoyancy to break the Ever Given free. On March 29th, at 4:30 a.m. local time, 14 tugboats pulled with maximum force during the peak of the spring tide. The Ever Given shifted slightly, the first real movement in 6 days. Engineers used the momentum immediately, directing tugboats to pull at precisely calculated angles while dredgers continued clearing sand from the bow. At 2 p.m., the stern broke free from the western bank. At 3:05 p.m., the bow finally pulled loose from the eastern embankment. The Ever Given was free, but it had taken 134 hours, 30,000 cubic meters of dredging, 14 tugboats, hundreds of workers, and an estimated $1 billion in salvage costs and economic damage per hour of blockage. The ship was immediately moved to the Great Bitter Lake, a wide section of the canal where it could be inspected without blocking traffic. Behind it, 422 ships that had accumulated in the queue during the 6-day blockage began the slow process of transit. The Suez Canal Authority announced that all waiting vessels would be cleared within 3 to 4 days, running the canal at maximum capacity 24 hours daily. But the backlog of goods and the supply chain disruptions would take months to resolve. And here's where the story takes its most important turn, because the Ever Given incident didn't just cause temporary disruptions. It fundamentally changed how companies think about supply chain risk. Let's talk about the financial aftermath, because the bills from this incident are still being paid today. The Ever Given incident triggered one of the most complex maritime insurance claims in history. The ship itself, owned by Japanese company Shoei Kisen Kaisha and operated by Taiwanese shipping firm Evergreen Marine, carried hull and machinery insurance valued at approximately $140 million. But that was just the beginning. The cargo aboard the Ever Given was insured for an estimated $775 million through multiple underwriters. Each of the 18,300 containers represented separate insurance policies, covering everything from electronics to automotive parts to consumer goods. The Egyptian government immediately filed a claim for $916 million in compensation, citing lost toll revenue, $15 million, salvage operation costs $300 million, damage to the canal, $100 million, and reputational damage $500 million. Yes, they literally tried to charge for hurt feelings. After months of negotiation, the final settlement reached approximately $550 million paid by the shipowners' insurance carriers. Egypt received compensation for actual costs, but dropped the reputational damage claim after realizing it was legally indefensible. But those numbers are trivial compared to the cascade of insurance claims from delayed shipments, missed delivery contracts, and supply chain disruptions across Europe and North America. Shipping companies filed claims for detention and deviation costs, the extra expenses incurred waiting in the queue or rerouting around Africa. Those claims totaled approximately $400 million across hundreds of vessels. Cargo owners filed business interruption claims for missed delivery deadlines, spoiled perishable goods, and contract penalties. European manufacturers alone submitted claims exceeding $1.2 billion for production delays, missed sales, and expedited shipping costs to source alternative supplies. Retailers filed for coverage of lost sales and promotional failures. One major European electronics chain reported a $45 million claim for spring promotional inventory that arrived 3 weeks late, missing key sales windows and requiring deep discounting to clear. The livestock carriers trapped in the queue faced particularly grim insurance claims. Approximately 200,000 animals were aboard ships waiting in the queue, and while most survived, animal welfare organizations reported that mortality rates exceeded normal levels due to stress, crowding, and depleted feed supplies. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London estimated that the total insured losses from the Ever Given incident reached approximately $3 billion, making it one of the costliest maritime incidents in history, despite zero loss of life and minimal physical damage to vessels. But here's what's really remarkable. The uninsured losses dwarfed even those massive insurance claims, and that's where companies learned the most expensive lesson. The Ever Given blockage cost retailers, manufacturers, and logistics companies an estimated additional $7 to $10 billion in uninsured losses. These weren't covered by any policy because they fell into gaps in coverage or exceeded deductibles. Opportunity costs from missed sales and promotional failures aren't typically covered by standard business interruption policies. Neither are the elevated freight costs from routing around Africa or securing alternative shipping capacity. Companies that needed their goods urgently began chartering cargo aircraft at astronomical costs. Air freight from Asia to Europe typically costs 8 to 12 times more than ocean shipping, but desperate retailers and manufacturers paid premium rates, sometimes $15 to $20 per kilogram, compared to typical rates of $4 to $6 per kilogram. One automotive manufacturer reported chartering 15 dedicated cargo flights to transport critical electronic components from South Korea to German assembly plants. The air freight cost $18 million compared to the $800,000 it would have cost to ship via ocean container, a 22-fold increase necessitated by the blockage. Fashion retailers faced similar pressures. Zara's parent company Inditex reportedly chartered multiple cargo flights to transport spring and summer collections from Asian suppliers, incurring costs exceeding $30 million to avoid missing seasonal sales windows. The total economic impact of the Ever Given incident reached approximately $60 billion when accounting for all direct losses, indirect costs, supply chain disruptions, and long-term consequences. That's roughly equivalent to the annual GDP of Kenya or Luxembourg. For context, that's more economic damage than Hurricane Harvey caused to Texas in 2017, more than the 2011 Thailand floods cost the global economy, and more than most natural disasters inflict despite the Ever Given incident being entirely man-made and theoretically preventable. The cost broke down roughly as follows. $15 million in lost Suez Canal toll revenue during the blockage, $300 million in salvage and repair costs, $550 million in direct settlement to Egypt, $3 billion in insured cargo and shipping losses, $10 billion in uninsured supply chain disruptions, and $45 billion in broader economic impacts across industries worldwide. But wait, it gets even more expensive when you factor in the long-term consequences. Because the Ever Given didn't just cost money in March 2021, it fundamentally restructured how global supply chains operate. Within weeks of the Ever Given incident, logistics analysts began publishing reports with titles like "The End of Just-in-Time" and "Why Inventory is Back." The message was clear: the era of zero-inventory supply chains had reached its breaking point. Companies across industries announced plans to rebuild inventory buffers and diversify shipping routes. Apple, which had pioneered ultra-lean supply chains in the consumer electronics industry, announced a $15 billion investment in supply chain resilience, including increased inventory holding and alternative sourcing. Automakers led the charge toward inventory rebuilding. General Motors announced it would increase component inventory from an average of 30 days to 60-90 days for critical parts, requiring an estimated $2 billion in additional working capital and 1 to 5 million square feet of new warehouse space. Ford implemented similar changes, expanding its parts inventory and increasing buffer stocks of semiconductors and other electronic components. The company estimated these changes would tie up an additional $1.5 billion in inventory carrying costs annually, but justified the expense as insurance against future disruptions. Retailers followed suit. Walmart, Target, and other major chains began building larger safety stocks of fast-moving consumer goods, particularly items sourced from Asia. Industry analysts estimated that U.S. retailers collectively added $30 billion in additional inventory in the year following the Ever Given incident. But inventory is just one piece of the response. Companies also began diversifying away from sole reliance on the Suez Canal route, and that's where things get really interesting from a financial perspective. Shipping companies increased investment in alternative routes and contingency planning. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company by capacity, announced a $7 billion investment in fleet expansion and route diversification to provide more flexibility when major bottlenecks occur. Some companies explored partial nearshoring, moving production closer to end markets to reduce dependence on long-distance ocean shipping. Mexico saw a surge in manufacturing investment from U.S. companies, with foreign direct investment in Mexican manufacturing facilities jumping 23% in 2022 compared to pre-pandemic levels. European companies accelerated nearshoring to Turkey, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. The European Union announced a €10 billion fund to support supply chain resilience through diversification and regional manufacturing capacity development. Technology investments surged as companies sought better visibility into supply chains. Spending on supply chain management software, real-time tracking systems, and predictive analytics tools increased by an estimated $12 billion annually as companies tried to build early warning systems for future disruptions. The total cost of supply chain restructuring triggered by the Ever Given incident reached an estimated $150 billion over 3 years across inventory rebuilding, nearshoring investments, technology deployments, and logistics infrastructure development. To put that number in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to building 15 new Panama Canals or launching 20 James Webb Space Telescopes. One ship stuck in one canal for 6 days triggered supply chain investments equivalent to multiple moon landing programs. And yet industry experts argue every penny of that investment was necessary, because what the Ever Given revealed wasn't just a vulnerability in one canal, it was a fundamental flaw in how modern logistics operates. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because the Ever Given incident exposed something most consumers never think about. Your entire modern lifestyle depends on a supply chain infrastructure operating at absolute maximum efficiency with zero margin for error. Consider this: 90% of global trade moves by sea. That's not a rough estimate, it's actual data from the International Maritime Organization. Approximately 11 billion tons of cargo crosses oceans annually on container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, and specialized vessels. Those 11 billion tons represent essentially everything you touch in a day. Your smartphone, shipped from Asia, your car, components from 30 countries assembled in one location, your coffee, transported from Ethiopia or Colombia, your clothes, made in Bangladesh or Vietnam. The global shipping network processes this unfathomable volume through just a handful of critical choke points, narrow passages where geography forces all traffic into concentrated streams vulnerable to disruption. The Suez Canal is one. The Panama Canal is another. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20% of global oil supply. The Strait of Malacca processes 25% of shipped goods between Asia and Europe. These choke points are the arteries of global commerce, and blocking any one of them causes economic heart attacks. Before the Ever Given, most executives and policymakers understood these choke points existed, but assumed the risk was manageable. The probability of a major blockage seemed low, and the financial benefits of efficient routing outweighed theoretical risks. The Ever Given proved that calculation catastrophically wrong. The incident demonstrated that these choke points aren't just vulnerable to war, terrorism, or natural disasters. They're vulnerable to simple accidents, human error, and bad weather. And once you start looking for these vulnerabilities, they're everywhere. The Suez Canal has no parallel alternative. It's a single-lane waterway for most of its length. The Panama Canal can handle only specific ship sizes due to lock dimensions. The Strait of Hormuz is just 1 miles wide at its narrowest point. If any of these choke points closed for an extended period, the economic consequences would dwarf the Ever Given incident. A month-long blockage of the Strait of Hormuz would paralyze 20% of global oil supply, potentially costing the global economy $200 billion or more. The Ever Given gave policymakers and executives a preview of what that level of disruption looks like, and the experience terrified them. Because the canal was cleared in 6 days, and that still cost $60 billion. Now, multiply that by a factor of 5 or 10 for a more strategic choke point blocked for longer, and you're looking at economic damage exceeding $1 trillion, enough to trigger a global recession. This realization drove much of the supply chain restructuring we discussed earlier. Companies aren't just rebuilding inventory buffers and diversifying routes for the Ever Given. They're preparing for the next chokepoint crisis, knowing it's not a question of if but when. The geopolitical implications are equally profound. Control of maritime choke points represents strategic power, and the Ever Given reminded every nation how vulnerable global trade is to disruptions in waterways controlled by individual countries. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. Panama controls the Panama Canal. Iran could theoretically close the Strait of Hormuz. Turkey controls the Bosphorus. These aren't just geographic facts. They're strategic realities that shape international relations and economic policy. China has invested heavily in alternative trade routes, precisely because of choke point vulnerability. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar infrastructure project, includes rail connections from China to Europe through Central Asia that bypass maritime choke points entirely. The Northern Sea Route, through the Arctic, made increasingly navigable by climate change, represents another potential alternative to traditional choke points. Russia is investing billions in icebreakers and port infrastructure to develop this route, which could reduce Asia-Europe shipping time by 40% while avoiding the Suez Canal entirely. These aren't just business decisions. They're strategic repositioning in anticipation of a future where choke point control determines economic power. The Ever Given accelerated this thinking from theoretical planning to urgent priority. But here's the really uncomfortable truth that the Ever Given exposed. Even with all these investments in resilience, redundancy, and alternative routes, the global supply chain will remain fundamentally fragile for decades to come. Building new trade routes takes years or decades. The Belt and Road rail network won't be fully operational until the 2030s at the earliest. The Northern Sea Route remains seasonal and limited in capacity, handling less than 2% of the volume the Suez Canal processes. Nearshoring and reshoring manufacturing sounds great in theory, but relocating production capacity from Asia to Mexico, Eastern Europe, or North Africa requires massive capital investment and years of facility construction, equipment installation, and workforce training. Companies have collectively announced $500 billion in nearshoring investments since 2021, but the actual relocated production capacity remains minimal. Most products you buy today still come from the same Asian factories through the same chokepoint-dependent shipping routes. This creates a paradox. Everyone recognizes the vulnerability. Everyone knows change is necessary. But the cost and time required to fundamentally restructure global supply chains means we're stuck with the existing fragile system for at least another decade. Then that means the risk of another ever-given scale disruption, or worse, remains unacceptably high. The next blockage might last longer, or might occur at multiple choke points simultaneously, or might coincide with other crises like pandemics or conflicts. The uncomfortable reality is that modern civilization operates on a supply chain infrastructure designed for efficiency, not resilience. We've built a just-in-time, zero-inventory, maximum efficiency global logistics network that generates enormous wealth and enables an unprecedented standard of living for billions of people. But that system only works if nothing ever goes seriously wrong, and the Ever Given proved that things go seriously wrong more often than we'd like to admit. Let me show you exactly how fragile this really is with some specific examples that should keep you up at night. The average American household contains approximately 300,000 items. Guess how many of those items were manufactured in the United States? About 1%, maybe 2% if you're generous with definitions. That's right. 98% of the physical objects in your home traveled thousands of miles through multiple choke points to reach you. Your television came through the Suez Canal or sailed around Africa. So did your laptop, your dishwasher, and probably your clothes. The components in your car passed through the Strait of Malacca and possibly the Panama Canal depending on assembly location. Even domestically manufactured products rely on imported components. That Made in USA tag on your appliance? It probably means final assembly occurred domestically, but the motors, circuit boards, displays, and raw materials came from Asia through maritime choke points. The food supply operates on similarly narrow margins. The United States imports 15% of its food supply, and those imports concentrate in specific high-value categories: 50% of fresh fruit, 55% of fresh vegetables, and nearly all coffee and cocoa. A sustained disruption to maritime shipping routes would empty produce sections in grocery stores within a week. Coffee supplies would run dry within a month. The economy might survive, but your morning routine definitely wouldn't. Now extrapolate this to critical supplies. The United States imports 70% of its medical supplies, 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and 90% of antibiotics. China controls approximately 60% of global antibiotic production capacity. A major maritime disruption lasting more than a few weeks would create genuine shortages of critical medications. Hospitals maintain roughly 30 days of supply for most drugs. Beyond that, you're looking at rationing and shortages of life-saving treatments. This isn't fear-mongering or hypothetical risk assessment. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw exactly these dynamics play out when air freight capacity dropped and maritime shipping faced delays. Pharmaceutical supply chains strained, hospitals rationed protective equipment, and medicine shortages appeared in multiple categories. The Ever Given added another week of delays on top of already disrupted supply chains, and healthcare systems in multiple countries reported inventory concerns for antibiotics, heart medications, and oncology drugs sourced from Asia. The electronics industry faces even tighter margins. Global semiconductor manufacturing concentrates in just 3 locations. Taiwan produces 65% of the world's chips. South Korea produces 17%. And Japan produces 9%. Those 3 countries control 91% of global semiconductor output. Every single semiconductor chip manufactured in Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan must transit either the Suez Canal or sail around Africa to reach European and American markets. There is no alternative route that doesn't add weeks and substantial costs. When the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal, multiple container ships carrying semiconductor shipments were stuck in the queue. Those delays cascaded across dozens of industries, from automotive manufacturing to consumer electronics to telecommunications equipment. One European automotive executive stated bluntly, "We were 6 days away from shutting down 3 assembly plants. If the Ever Given had been stuck for 2 weeks instead of 6 days, we would have laid off 15,000 workers." That's how thin the margins are. That's how completely modern industry depends on nothing ever going wrong in global logistics. And that's why the Ever Given scared logistics executives and supply chain managers more than any other event in recent history. Because at least with the COVID-19 pandemic, the disruptions were gradual and somewhat predictable. Shutdowns happened over weeks, giving companies time to adjust. The Ever Given demonstrated that disruption can be instantaneous, total, and entirely random. One ship, one sandstorm, 6 days. That's all it took to reveal that trillions of dollars in global commerce depend on a handful of vessels successfully navigating narrow waterways without incident thousands of times per year. The mathematics of risk are sobering. Approximately 50,000 container ships, tankers, bulk carriers, and other commercial vessels are at sea at any given time. If just 0.1% of those vessels experience serious incidents annually, that's 50 major maritime accidents per year. Most accidents are minor and localized, but when one happens in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time, like the Ever Given in the Suez Canal, the consequences can be economically catastrophic. And here's the terrifying part. As ships get bigger, the potential damage from each incident increases. The Ever Given is part of a class of vessels called ultra-large container ships, the biggest container ships ever built. These behemoths carry 20,000 to 24,000 TEU, compared to typical large container ships that carry 10,000 to 15,000 TEU. They're 400 meters long, 60 meters wide, and can transport $1 billion worth of goods in a single voyage. The economics of scale make these giant ships incredibly efficient. They're cheaper per container to operate than smaller vessels, but they also represent concentrated risk. When a small container ship runs into trouble, it carries 5,000 containers worth maybe $200 million. When an ultra-large container ship like the Ever Given has a problem, it's carrying 20,000 containers worth potentially $1 billion. And if that ultra-large container ship blocks a major choke point, you're looking at the Ever Given incident, which we've now thoroughly documented cost at least $60 billion in direct and indirect consequences. The shipping industry continues building even larger vessels. Several container ships capable of carrying 24,000 TEU are under construction or recently launched. Each one represents even greater concentration of cargo value and even larger potential disruptions if something goes wrong. The economic incentives push inexorably toward bigger ships, because bigger ships are more profitable per container. But the systemic risk increases proportionally, perhaps even exponentially, because bigger ships cause bigger disruptions in the rare events when things go wrong. This is the central tension in modern logistics. Efficiency demands concentration, but concentration creates fragility. The most profitable supply chain is also the most vulnerable supply chain. The Ever Given forced this tension into sharp relief, and it's not clear that anyone has figured out how to resolve it. Companies want resilience, but they also want profitability. Governments want strategic independence, but they also want cheap consumer goods. So, we continue operating a global supply chain system that everyone acknowledges is dangerously fragile, because the alternatives are either too expensive or too slow to implement, and because hoping for the best remains cheaper than preparing for the worst, until catastrophe strikes. Now let's talk about what actually changed in practical terms after the Ever Given, because despite all the rhetoric about supply chain resilience and strategic repositioning, the reality is both more limited and more expensive than you might expect. The Suez Canal Authority responded with the most direct solution: make the canal bigger so that future incidents can be resolved faster or prevented entirely. In May 2021, 2 months after the Ever Given blockage, Egypt announced a $2 billion expansion project. The expansion plan includes widening the southern single-lane section of AI and Port Authority's accelerated automation investments specifically to reduce turnaround time and increase capacity, providing more buffer in the system to absorb disruptions. Rotterdam, Singapore, and Los Angeles invested a combined $8 billion in automated cranes, autonomous vehicles, and AI-powered logistics systems between 2021 and 2024. Construction began in 2021 and completed in 2023, with Egyptian authorities claiming the improvements reduced the risk of another major blockage by approximately 70%. Whether that statistic is accurate remains untested. Thankfully, there hasn't been another major incident to validate the claim. The expansion cost $2 billion, but generated minimal additional toll revenue because ship traffic didn't materially increase. Egypt effectively spent $2 billion on insurance against a repeat of a $60 billion disaster, which is actually a reasonable investment when framed that way. Insurance companies implemented sweeping changes to maritime insurance policies, particularly for vessels transiting key choke points. Premiums for ultra-large container ships increased 15–20% in a year, following the Ever Given incident, with additional premium charges for Suez Canal transit. Some insurers now require vessels over a certain size to carry specialized blockage liability insurance, covering potential economic damages if the vessel obstructs a major waterway. These policies carry premiums of $500,000 to $1 million per voyage, and deductibles reaching $100 million. The practical effect is that shipping the largest vessels through choke points became noticeably more expensive, creating modest economic pressure to use smaller ships or alternative routes. But the pressure isn't sufficient to fundamentally change shipping patterns. Big ships remain more profitable even with higher insurance costs. Technology companies developed new supply chain visibility platforms in response to the Ever Given disruption. Project 44, Forkites, and other logistics software firms raised a combined $2 billion in venture capital in 2021–2022 to build real-time tracking systems that provide earlier warning of potential disruptions. AI and Port Authority's accelerated automation investments specifically to reduce turnaround time and increase capacity, providing more buffer in the system to absorb disruptions. Rotterdam, Singapore, and Los Angeles invested a combined $8 billion in automated cranes, autonomous vehicles, and AI-powered logistics systems between 2021 and 2024. Adoption has been substantial but incomplete. Large enterprises like Walmart, Amazon, and major manufacturers deployed comprehensive tracking systems, but smaller companies often can't justify the cost. Enterprise software licenses run $500,000 to $2 million annually, depending on scale. The result is a two-tier system where sophisticated large companies have significantly better supply chain visibility than smaller competitors, creating competitive advantages in managing disruptions, but also raising barriers to entry for new market participants. Port Authority's accelerated automation investments specifically to reduce turnaround time and increase capacity, providing more buffer in the system to absorb disruptions. Rotterdam, Singapore, and Los Angeles invested a combined $8 billion in automated cranes, autonomous vehicles, and AI-powered logistics systems between 2021 and 2024. These investments increased port throughput by 15–20% at the most advanced facilities, reducing the time ships spend in port from an average of 2–3 days to 1–2 days. The faster turnaround means ships can complete. These investments sound impressive, but the new facilities will produce less than 10% of current U.S. semiconductor demand when fully operational. The United States will remain heavily dependent on Asian semiconductor imports for the foreseeable future. Amazon built its own shipping and logistics network in part as a strategic response to chokepoint vulnerabilities revealed by the Ever Given. The company invested $61 billion in logistics infrastructure between 2020 and 2023, including fulfillment centers, sorting facilities, delivery vehicles, cargo aircraft, and ocean containers. By 2024, Amazon operated 175 fulfillment centers globally, 110 sortation centers, 42 dedicated cargo aircraft, and leased space on hundreds of container ships. The company now controls enough logistics capacity to handle approximately 70% of its own deliveries without relying on UPS, FedEx, or traditional ocean carriers. This vertical integration provides Amazon with supply chain resilience unavailable to competitors. When the next major disruption occurs, Amazon can reroute shipments, adjust inventory allocation, and leverage owned capacity in ways that traditional retailers cannot. The competitive advantage is substantial and growing. Analysts estimate Amazon's logistics control saves the company $12 to $15 billion annually, compared to outsourcing everything to third-party carriers, while simultaneously providing strategic flexibility worth billions more in avoided disruption costs. Other retailers attempted to follow Amazon's lead, but found the capital requirements prohibitive. Walmart invested $14 billion in logistics infrastructure between 2021 and 2023, but the company still relies on external carriers for the majority of inbound freight from overseas suppliers. The reality is that only the largest, most profitable companies can afford to build parallel supply chain infrastructure. Everyone else remains dependent on the same fragile maritime shipping system that the Ever Given exposed as dangerously vulnerable. Manufacturing companies pursued a different strategy, building regional production capacity to reduce dependence on long-distance shipping. But actual implementation has been slower and more limited than initial announcements suggested. Intel announced a $20 billion investment to build semiconductor manufacturing facilities in Arizona, with production scheduled to begin in 2024. TSMC, the world's largest chip maker, announced a $40 billion investment in U.S. manufacturing capacity, with factories planned in Arizona and Texas. These investments sound impressive, but the new facilities will produce less than 10% of current U.S. semiconductor demand when fully operational. The United States will remain heavily dependent on Asian semiconductor imports for the foreseeable future. Automotive companies announced similar nearshoring initiatives. General Motors committed $7 billion to battery production in the United States. Ford announced $11 billion in U.S. manufacturing expansion, and multiple suppliers opened facilities in Mexico to serve North American assembly plants. These investments are real and substantial, but they're also long-term projects requiring 5–10 years to fully materialize. In the meantime, automakers remain dependent on Asian suppliers for semiconductors, batteries, and electronic components, the exact supply chain vulnerabilities exposed by the Ever Given. The pharmaceutical industry faces the most intractable challenges. Rebuilding domestic antibiotic production capacity would require an estimated $50 to $100 billion in capital investment, plus ongoing subsidies to offset higher U.S. labor costs compared to Asian production. No company has announced credible plans to reshore pharmaceutical production at scale, because the economics don't work without substantial government subsidies or tariff protection. Some specialty drugs and critical vaccines have seen limited domestic production expansion, but generic drugs and antibiotics remain overwhelmingly imported. The U.S. government established a $1 billion fund for pharmaceutical supply chain resilience through the CHIPS and Science Act, but industry analysts estimate that amount would fund approximately 2% of the necessary investment to achieve meaningful domestic production capacity. So despite all the announcements, investments, and strategic pivots following the Ever Given incident, the fundamental structure of global supply chains remains largely unchanged. Most products still come from Asia through the same choke points, via the same vulnerable maritime routes. What has changed is awareness, contingency planning, and inventory buffers. Companies now maintain larger safety stocks, have better visibility into supply chain risks, and carry insurance against disruptions. But the underlying dependency on efficient, fragile, choke-point-dependent logistics remains. The next major disruption, whether it's another ship in the Suez Canal, a typhoon in the Strait of Malacca, conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, or an earthquake affecting Asian manufacturing, will cause similar or worse economic damage than the Ever Given. And that brings us to the most important lesson from the entire Ever Given saga. Modern civilization is far more fragile than most people realize, and the supply chains enabling your daily life operate on the edge of failure continuously. Let me tie this all together with the single most important insight from the Ever Given incident. And it's not what you think. The most important lesson isn't about maritime safety, insurance, or supply chain diversification. The most important lesson is this: efficiency and resilience are fundamentally opposed, and for the past 40 years, global commerce has chosen efficiency over resilience at every decision point. The Ever Given was the bill coming due for that choice. Every efficiency gain in logistics makes the system more profitable, but also more fragile. Just-in-time inventory eliminates waste, but removes buffers. Larger ships reduce costs, but concentrate risk. Choke-point-dependent routes are faster, but vulnerable to disruption. For decades, these trade-offs worked brilliantly. The probability of major disruption remained low enough that efficiency gains outweighed occasional problems. Companies made billions by cutting inventory, consolidating routes, and maximizing ship sizes. But probability isn't fate. Low probability events still occur, and when they do, the consequences in an optimized for efficiency system are catastrophic. The Ever Given was a warning shot, a relatively minor incident that still cost $60 billion and took 6 days to resolve. Now imagine a scenario where the Suez Canal is blocked for a month instead of 6 days, or imagine multiple choke points disrupted simultaneously by conflict, natural disasters, or coordinated attacks. The economic damage could easily reach hundreds of billions or even $1 trillion. The terrifying realization is that modern global commerce operates continuously on the edge of that precipice. We've built a system so efficient that it has no tolerance for error, no capacity to absorb shocks, and no redundancy to root around problems. And we've done this knowingly, because efficiency generates profits today, while resilience costs money to prevent problems that might never occur. Every company faces the same calculation: spend millions on redundancy that might never be needed, or maximize profits and hope nothing goes wrong. Individually, the rational choice is efficiency. Collectively, the result is systemic fragility. This is the classic tragedy of the commons. What makes sense for each company creates risk for the entire system. The Ever Given exposed this dynamic in the most public and expensive way possible. A single ship operated by one company made one mistake in one location and nearly paralyzed global commerce. That shouldn't be possible in a resilient system. But it is possible because we built a hyper-efficient system instead of a resilient one. And changing that requires collective action, government policy, and willingness to sacrifice some efficiency for robustness, none of which happens easily or quickly. So here's where we stand, 3 years after the Ever Given. Everyone understands the problem. Lots of money has been spent on partial solutions, and the fundamental vulnerability remains essentially unchanged. The next major disruption will cause similar chaos, trigger similar losses, and prompt similar declarations that this time we'll really fix the supply chain. And then economic pressures will push companies right back toward efficiency over resilience, because that's what generates profits and competitive advantage. This cycle will continue until either the cost of disruptions becomes so frequent and severe that resilience becomes economically justified, or governments intervene with regulations requiring supply chain redundancy, regardless of private cost considerations. Neither outcome seems imminent. So we'll continue operating a global supply chain that generates enormous wealth and enables unprecedented living standards, while remaining perpetually vulnerable to disruption from events as simple as one ship getting stuck in one canal for 6 days. The Ever Given cost $60 billion, trapped 400 ships, paralyzed 12% of global trade and revealed that modern logistics operates without margins for error. And the most disturbing part? It could easily happen again tomorrow, and there's not much anyone can do to prevent it. That's the real story of the Ever Given. Not a tale of maritime accident and recovery, but a demonstration that the supply chains enabling modern civilization are far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. We've built our prosperity on a foundation of optimized efficiency that sacrifices resilience, and the Ever Given showed us exactly what that choice costs. 6 days, one ship, $60 billion in economic damage, and a clear warning that next time might be worse. If you want to understand how global logistics really works and why your Amazon package sometimes gets delayed, hit subscribe because we're diving deep into the supply chain stories that shape your daily life. And trust me, once you see how this system actually operates, you'll never look at a shipping container the same way again. The Ever Given isn't just history, it's a preview of the future. The question isn't whether another major choke point disruption will occur. The question is when and whether we'll have learned anything from the $60 billion lesson we just received.